you're educated by, who recommends stuff to you, and probably where you go for additional information. So as a practicing coach, I've worked in different levels of the game, different opportunities, male and female game, youth and adults. So an experience of working as a coach. As a coach educator, I started out, again, probably in the 90s sometime, as being a coach educator, delivering what qualifications the FA had at the time, which was a junior team managers award, and the prelim coaching certificate was the level 2, I suppose, of its time. So I started out working as a coach educator doing that, and then over the last 13 years, I was working at the FA full-time as a coach developer, a coach educator, and then got involved in the design of a number of courses. The level 1 and the B license were stuff that I was sort of responsible for alongside others, and probably the assessment models that changed for people who are on the call would remember maybe old style assessments where you either passed or were deemed not yet competent at the time. And that sort of test system was a real bugbear, I think, for everybody. And so we evolved a new assessment model at the time. This is probably going back 5 years now, where we try to deal with coaches in their own reality and see them and the warts and all side of things and assessed accordingly. So reality-based learning became a big piece of sort of coach ed, and seeing coaches in the real world was something that that sort of, I suppose, started 5 years ago and probably still exists now. And I think me as a coach now, having moved away from the FA over the last few months and started out as a coach and getting my football fix, if you want, from working in the game, I now see coaching in an even greater reality than I did previously. And so this is a bit of a reflection on me as a coach and probably the processes that we as coaches go through. And hopefully it'll stimulate some thought and maybe get you to consider your own actions, because it's certainly something that's doing it to me.
Your volume's not great, mate. Keep freezing on us.
Remember, he was a player, played for England, won the World Cup, played alongside his brother, and was managed by 2 people. One was Alf Ramsey, who was the England manager for most of his time at England, and the other one was Don Revie. And Don Revie was the Leeds United manager who led Leeds in the 60s and 70s to their successes. And Jack became a coach. He coached at Middlesbrough, Sheffield Wednesday. He was at Newcastle for a little bit. Didn't have the best of times in some of the clubs he was at, but he had some real successes as a coach, taking the Irish national team to 2 World Cups. And he had his own way of doing things. He had his own style. And it didn't necessarily sit well with a lot of people and a lot of sort of purists, but the guy was out and out a really passionate man about being a coach. And he told a story once about how, as a player, he didn't really appreciate what it was that coaches went through or had to try and consider when it came to doing practices and the game. His story was this, that he was playing in the World Cup side and they were at Lilleshall at a training camp. And as Alf Ramsey had dictated one day that they were going to have an 11v11 game. So the squad came together and he separated them into 2 groups, and the players got changed in different changing rooms, and he tried to treat it as a match opportunity for the players and for himself. And just before they're about to go out the changing rooms, this scientist, as Jack referred to him, came into the room and he said to them, "I want you all to remember certain things." So he sat the group down and he said to the players, "You're going to remember these names of different animals I'm going to tell you." So he said to one player, horse, the next player, giraffe, the next player, zebra, and he went round the room. He said, "I want you to remember these things." the game gets to played, they get to half time, they come back in, Alf Ramsey does his team talk, the scientist goes round and asks them the different animals that they had to remember. Half of the players, in fact 3/4 of the players, couldn't remember what it was that they had been told. Told them again, sent them back out, came in at the end of 90 minutes, and the similar thing appeared. Telling the players wasn't simply good enough. The players had to go and experience stuff, was the message. And so what Jack was saying and what Alf Ramsey was saying at the time was, if we didn't practice stuff, we wouldn't necessarily be able to perform it. If we did practice stuff, we had to make sure that what we were practicing was as realistic as possible so that we could deal with those situations when they would occur. So with Jack's story in mind, I sort of bring myself onto my stuff today and about some of the things that I've been sort of witnessing as a coach educator, and then also witnessing as a coach in my own behaviours, but also seeing others over the last couple of years, I suppose, but certainly over the last couple of months. We all debate this thing around, you know, the theory of coaching or the theory of building practice and such like. But actually, when it boils down to it, what does it look like and feel like when we have to do it in the real world, in practice? And I think one of the things I'm trying to get myself to consider, and hopefully you guys as coaches will be, how are our behaviours affected by the actions of the players, or maybe it's the actions of the design of practice that you may well have built? So through some of the work I'm doing at the moment, I was watching a coach work not so long ago. Well, it probably will be now because we've been in lockdown for a good few weeks. But I was watching a guy work who set up a practice, and the players had set themselves up around this area, and they were going to be doing something around sort of passing into somebody, following the pass. Player would then set it for somebody else, move on to another cone. And it was a real pattern type practice. There was a couple of coaches working with a group, and the practice went ahead. And as the players were practicing, the passes start going astray, and the coach keeps shouting, "Well done, that's great, keep going." Lots of praise, lots of encouragement, which is great to some extent. But there was a real issue with how the practice was going. When the players mishit a pass, or when the players maybe hit the cone instead of hitting aiming for the player, or when a player had to go and have 2 or 3 touches to get the ball under control before they could then pass it on to somebody else, the practice was starting to break down. The coach didn't do much about it apart from continue with the praise. And I was talking to somebody and we said, is there not a time here when, as a coach, we have to insist on either better, or we have to ask the players about what it is that they're actually producing at the moment? The practice went on. It got a slight variation to it. Players did it again. Things started to break down. Players started to lose interest in the practice. Again, the coach steps in, gives them an alternative, and off they go again. And I could see myself and in the actions of this coach, giving praise to the players, encouraging a lot. But at the same time, I could also see there was bits that I thought, is there not a time when we need to try and help here? Practice finishes, and the next step for the players was a 5v5 game. Players go into the game, and the coach asks the players to continue to do the same things that they've just been practicing. The only difference now, however, was the fact that there's a number of players on the pitch who are going to break this practice up, who aren't going to let you pass and follow the pass, who are going to mark the receiving player, who are maybe going to put themselves in positions where they could intercept. And of course, the game starts breaking down. The coach now gets frustrated and starts to demonstrate with the players around what it is that's happening and why it's happening and how they should be better. And I kept thinking back, but they didn't get a chance to learn this bit until now, when the reality of the game and the reality of the opposition is starting to ask questions of them. So I suppose my question is, what is it we accept as coaches, whether we're in the development opportunities with younger players or whether we're in that more of a performance environment where the results matter at the weekend? What's the sort of things that we try and do? And what is it we actually accept? So my considerations at the moment as a practicing coach is to start my reflections probably from before the ball actually rolls. One of the challenges I face at the moment is not necessarily knowing what numbers are going to turn up. So does my 12-man practice actually work when only 10 arrive, or 13 turn up because I didn't know such and such was coming? And as the practice rolls on, do I look after the players in terms of praise and encouragement, lots of positives, but do I also try and demand better from them? Because knowing what I need to know about the opposition that we're going to face, or the type of game that we might be playing in the future, you know, do we demand different levels of returns, but if you want, from the players? And I suppose this reflection piece is not only in action, but post-action. When I finish, what's my thought process now? What sort of things in the heat of the moment do I maybe consider, but also what sort of things do I park for the time being and maybe pick up in a day or so's time? My other consideration at the moment is, but what about the non-action? What about the bit when I haven't done stuff, when I could have? Will that come back to haunt me? And should I maybe look at it differently in the future? Because if I don't rectify things in training, if I don't help the players in training, what's going to be the impact when it comes to my behaviours and possibly the players' actions when we go into games? So what I'd like you to do for the next 2 minutes or so, just as we try and maybe pick up some questions, is what are your actions and behaviours like in training or in games? What sort of things do you do once that ball rolls, once those X's and O's start moving? What sort of things do you do? Do you consider the planning side of things that you've pulled together, or do you allow the players just to continue? So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to have a chat, have a think, and then maybe we can pick up some questions from Steve and some of the guys as we go forward. Does that sound all right, Steve, for now?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I've got a couple of questions just while people are reflecting on their own practice. It's the first thing I want to raise is, I guess it's all about expectations, isn't it? So as a coach, what are your expectations and where do they come from? And do they match the players? Do you see what I mean? So, you know, where do you get that level from? Is it you know what they can do, so you expect it all the time? Is it, I've worked with this group before, so they should be there? Do you see what I mean? Where do we measure what we expect from them?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think sometimes when we try and write stuff down, it's this idealistic notion that, you know, we're showing X passing to O and running somewhere else, and that will happen. Now, whether that's us seeing our players do that, or whether it's us watching sort of the elite performer execute that type of thing, and therefore we consider that is, this should be what they are able to do. So maybe the frustration from us is that we don't consider it from what we know about our players first and foremost. And if we do it from that perspective, are we then going to try and help to make them better at doing this?
Nice, appreciate it. And my next point is not a question, it's more of an observation. Before I think Libby might be a couple of questions relevant to this, but my observation is, and I don't know if you agree, but the example you gave was around taking an unopposed, isolated practice, then taking that into a fully opposed. And I was talking about this earlier with a group actually, but I don't think we're great at that. Whether that's in this country, I think we're sloppy when it comes to repetitive, isolated practices, drills, if you like. I don't know if you'd agree, but I just think we're sloppy.
Yeah, I think it's funny, isn't it? I think when we both worked at the FA, we went through a phase of trying to introduce more games for players to play in because they got more game opportunities than what they were getting, you know, with one session a week and a game at the weekend. And, you know, the drill type thing was sort of alienated. It was considered, you know, not to be the best of use of time and such like. But for me, I still think it has a real place. I just think it's how do you link it to the game that you and they play. So if in the game you receive a ball in time, with time and space, and can pass the ball forward, that might be very limited in the game. But if that's what you always get, then you probably need some opportunity in practice that's what you get. However, if you're playing into somebody who's always marked, the challenge now is trying to recognise when to pass to them, where to pass to them, what type of pass possibly to use. So you've got to have if you want an array of techniques and an understanding of timing and types of release and such like to do that more effectively to a player who is under pressure in an opposed situation. So you might say, well, actually, I need 3 players in this practice, one to deal with the receiving player and one to allow the player to have free time and space to play. But if in the game you get closed down, and whether that's from a player in front or from a player who's coming from the side, then similarly, you probably need that type of element of rehearsal, if you want, in your practice that allows you to transfer it to the game. So I think, I don't think we should shy away from drills. I think they have got mileage. It's just how game-like can you make those drills, in my humble opinion, if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Maybe anything from the chat that's relevant you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on it a little bit, but there's a good question here. It's like, how do you strike the balance between realism and repetition, like unopposed, opposed, and progressions versus regressions? You've touched on it a bit there, but
yeah,
balance.
I think, you know, being a practicing coach now, I'm back in the real world with everybody else, and I wrestle with it, and I think I set things up thinking more game type things is what the players I'm working with need, but it breaks down. I also know that if we do some repetition type stuff, it'll break down because it lacks the realism. So I'm the same as everybody else. I can't stick a percentage on it, but I definitely wrestle with the ideas of, should this be opposed? Should that element of it be opposed and that bit free? You know, does it always need direction? Do both teams need the same, you know, focus in terms of the returns, or can we shift it to allow for different things? So I'm in a similar position to everybody else on the call. Really, I probably wrestle with how close to the real game do I want it to look without it breaking down, and vice versa. How far away from the game does it need to be to allow for success, but not to the extent where it doesn't give them game understanding, if you want.
Sorry, just to follow on from that, I think George has made a really good point, and it does, all of this goes back to knowing your players. So what's right for one group is not necessarily right for another. And also within groups, what's right for one player isn't necessarily right for the player within that group. That's what makes it so difficult, isn't it?
No, it is, absolutely. Absolutely. Let me just shuffle on a little bit then. So, you know, this won't look unfamiliar to anybody on the call. We've been using a sort of 4 corners approach to sort of practice design and player development for years now. And I think, you know, any one of us, for whatever session we were going to do with our players, would probably populate the corners with some information. And these are, you know, I forget whose Twitter account I got this picture of, but, you know, this is typical of what the sort of things we'd put in there. I think people have already sort of touched on it. You know, we need to know our players. So what is the ability of those players in those different corners? What's the application like? You know, how do they apply themselves in training or in games? I know, working with some of the players I'm with at the moment, that it'll depend on a number of things. Does the practice itself actually enthuse and engage them, and is it something they want to be part of? If they feel it isn't relevant to them, it might be that actually that they don't apply themselves to the fullest. What is their attitude to playing at the moment? Is it a recreational thing and they're not necessarily there all the time? Is it more of a performance piece where they're training twice a week and they're playing at the weekends, and results matter and salaries and such like are being paid, and therefore how they apply themselves is
Tony, you keep losing your sound. Well, not keep. Every now and again, we lose your sound, Tony.
We're doing something and we think, oh, that looks great, I'll use that. But, does it fire the imagination and the enthusiasm of our group? Does it need to be something that is relevant for them? How do we group our players? What is that social setup of your squad? Because I think some players work really well with each other, have great friendships. Others that they're not as close a friendship, if you want. They're more an associate, and therefore they'll get on with each other, but they won't necessarily socialise or have the same sense of humour or follow the same interests. So again, how do you as a coach sort of factor that in? And I think if you put practices together where you have similar sort of players, you might find there's a bit of I suppose a bit of an approach by one group which will be different to another. So some might be really demanding high standards of each other, and others might be just having a bit of a laugh and are happy to go through the motions, and therefore mixing those groups that wouldn't necessarily help one or the other. But at the same time, why do you allow for that when if what you're after is an improvement in performance? I think one of the things I'm very conscious of now, and that's probably because of the club that I'm working at, our facilities aren't necessarily the best. We train on grass, we train under lights, we play on the same pitch. And if we've had a game, the chances are the pitch isn't in the best of order when it comes to train. If we train on it, it won't necessarily be in the best of order when it comes to play. So how do we juggle that? Where do we locate ourselves on the site? What sort of stuff can we do off to the side? What sort of stuff can we do on the pitch? Those sort of things have definitely become something I'm factoring into my planning. And also, if I know X is going to pass to O and that ball goes 30 yards across a bit of a bobbly, muddy pitch, I need to factor that in. I need to know what that looks like now, because that will determine how the practice works and possibly, what successes we get. And I think all of us in this country have to factor in the weather. We deal with it all the time. And whether that's on a training night or a match day, we know that the weather conditions will play a part. And whether that is, it's a wet surface or it's a windy day or it's sunlight, it is something that factors into, our planning. And I think if these are parts of what we consider, then I think we're getting better at being more effective.
Tony, wasn't it? I think it was Vialli years ago, didn't he say that the reason, and sort of a few years ago, that we maybe weren't as technically as good as the Italians at the time, and the Spanish, was because we spend all of our lives trying to keep kids running around and keep them warm. He probably had a point, didn't he? You think of summer training, where we haven't got the pressure of that hour on the Astro. We can maybe let it last for 2 hours, and we're not in a rush, and they can have a bit more focus on technique. I don't know. Yeah,
there's been a lot of calls, isn't there, for the game to move. It's certainly the youth game to move to a sort of spring through to autumn season, and there's always been objections to it. Whether that's from other sports or whether that's from people involved in football at the moment. Thinking that football needs to be played between 1st of August and the 31st of May, and that's it. It can't happen any other time. But other countries do things differently. Northern Ireland a few years ago changed their model and went to a sort of spring to autumn season after the furore of and noise sort of settled down. People just got on with it and accepted it. Now, whether it still exists that way, I don't know, but it was something that they did differently because they just thought, you know, well, weather is one thing. If the winter months mean lots of cancellations and lack of opportunities, let's shift it to allow the kids to play at a different time, and with the light nights and the drier surfaces and such, like maybe the game will look different. So yeah, it is something that we need to possibly consider. There's a lot of mention, I think, in coaching circles when people talk about the detail, and it generally, for me, it tends to be this technical stuff. You know, the attention to detail in you know, the pass, or the attention to detail on the receiving touch. You know, if you look at the definition of detail, and this is Google's bit, you know, it's an individual fact or item, an ingredient, an attribute, an element, whatever it might be. And we seem to go after this technical thing as being the holy grail, but I think at the same time we need to consider the detail in these other areas, the stuff we've just sort of touched upon. So at the moment, I'm working in a senior non-league opportunity with Wellington. They're in the Western League's Prem, which is step below the Southern League. They aren't one of the big teams in the league. They're a lovely club, great people who've been there for years, who are, you know, the salt of the earth volunteers who help, and the players who they recruit, you know, try their best. They're certainly not a big paying club. They're trying their best to play the game in a certain way. The lad who is the manager and who was a player there wants the game to be played in a certain way, and therefore the people who come and play for the club have got to buy into that. And certainly the things it's sort of thrown up for me is knowing the players, and I think someone touched on this earlier. What is their, you know, their ability, but also what's their history, where have they come from, what is it they've played like before, who did they play for, what sort of things did they bring with them in terms of experience, what is their current situation, you know, are they self-employed, full-time in a job, are they a, you know, policeman, teacher, electrician, plasterer, whatever it might be, because all of these will factor into me as a coach when it comes to trying to understand what it is I'm going to get for training, what it is that's going to be available for match days, how we're going to build practices based around them. And, you know, what is their motive? It's certainly not financial at Wellington. You know, they aren't a big paying club, but the guys turn up and apply themselves as best they can. They've got real intent about being footballers in non-league football, and they want to get better at doing it. So I'm blessed in that sense with a group of lads who really do want to be better at this thing. I don't think that's always been their intentions of the past, and so maybe there is something between how myself and others are trying to work with them and the things we're trying to do, which is sort of made their focus and their intent better for this season, although we've been put on hold the same as everybody else. The one thing I didn't know when I sort of got involved with this was the game itself. And, you know, we can all have these ideas around, you know, we'll think we'll play like this, but unless you know what the opposition will pose, unless you know what the league, sort of the history of the league and the understanding of teams and clubs and such like within that league, unless you know the different pitches that you might play on, you will be found wanting. So I think it's been an eye-opener for me over the last sort of 2 seasons, really, part of last season and some of this season in its sort of disjointed way, to get an understanding of, you know, how the league is, what the opposition are like, how the opposition like to play, what sort of things we can do against certain teams, what sort of things we're not going to be able to do. And definitely the facilities that we play on, some of the pitches that we play on are fantastic. Some of the facilities are great. And then others, including our own, is a real challenge. But if you want, they're a leveler for everybody because we all end up playing on them. But it's certainly been something that I've had to really factor into my planning as a coach, is to understand the game that we play in, not the game generally, but the game that we play in. Because that's where I need to factor into my planning. What will the opponent do to us? So if we're playing against a team who play 4-4-2 against us, and we might play a different shape to that, do I really know what their 4-4-2 looks like? What will they try and do to us using that shape, both in and out of possession? And sometimes, we don't get a chance to understand that until the game starts. But we're best guessing some of this stuff in our planning, so to hopefully prepare the players as best we can.
It's interesting, a couple of points on that, Tone. So interesting what you say there about their game or your game, the game you're playing in. So it makes me think back probably 2 or 3 years to when the UEFA B was relaunched. I was working with a lad who played a good level and gone into coaching management, and he showed me his kind of playing style, and it was the same level as what you're talking about. And I'm thinking, oh, all right, okay. And it was almost like he felt we wanted to hear that they're playing out from the back through the third, through the team. He was always telling me what I wanted to hear. But actually then my first in situ support was, it was a Tuesday night at home. It was windy, the pitch was tight, the opposition were horrible. And guess what? You're going to play like that. And that's the game. That's football, isn't it? It's adapting, isn't it, to the circumstances, to the environment. So it quickly ripped up and started and was made a bit more relevant. And then the other one I just want to touch on before we open it up to the guys and gals is the motivations you mentioned. I think that's huge for me. I work with a ladies team at the moment when we're allowed, and I'm really intrigued to get to know what their motivations are. So I dangle carrots a little bit, and so it's kind of that I'm here if you need me. If any of you want to speak to me about your game, now 1 or 2, 3 have come with emails or whatever, and then I give them so much information they probably wish they hadn't have asked. But I don't assume people want to know. I don't assume that they want to get better. One of our best players is in her 30s and probably could do without training, really, but it's still one of our best players. So it's wrestling with those, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it really is. We had a young lad that broke his leg in a game. Just a heavy challenge. It wasn't anything malicious or anything. And the young lad was an apprentice plasterer. Some people might have picked up on this because it ended up on Twitter, but a lad who was a friend of his put a Just Giving page up and stuck something on Twitter about trying to raise £500 for this lad, just as a stopgap, if you want, because he was going to be off work. Like I say, he was an apprentice plasterer, and he wouldn't have been on much money to start with, but he was going to be on even less when it came to working for not being able to work for somebody. And everybody at the club and people who knew him all started chipping in money. And then Ollie Watkins at Aston Villa made a contribution, and it was only because Ollie knew the lad, but also knew the guy who was trying to run the Just Giving piece for him. And you just think, these guys do everything they can to try and play at the weekend. That situations could, if something like an injury takes place, could change dramatically. And it was just so nice to see everybody sort of get together and commit something financially for the lad, but also that people outside of the club itself and the league, if you want, started to find money and made donations towards his situation. So yeah, I think understanding them and their motive and their intent is really crucial for me.
Cool. It's over to you.
Just let me finish off with
apologies.
A little bit, sorry. So what I thought, just with this idea, so that we have these concepts, if you want, and I think everybody wrestles with these around, we'll play out from the back, or we'll rotate in midfield and all this sort of stuff. And things become very, I suppose, very fashionable at times, don't they? It's like, we must play with 4-3-3 because that's how such and such do it. But realistically, our players are our players, and we have to understand what it is they can and can't do. One thing that the players think was that we need to have a rotating midfield, but we don't necessarily know why we're rotating. It's just something that is trending, if you want, it's at the moment. So we have to establish, well, this is a midfield setup, if you want to start with, and then we can start to get to a rotating understanding. It won't come overnight. So that's been one of the things that, the players perceive rotating midfield, but the reality is we need to understand how to just have a functioning midfield before we can start getting players to play in different positions and understand the reasons why and when and how we rotate. Overlapping fullbacks, again, it's fashionable and people talk about fullbacks now in the top end of the game, working from byline to byline. So they defend on their own goal line and prevent crosses in, and at the same time they're expected to get, in some cases beyond their wide player and down to the goal line on the opposite end of the field and put crosses in and such like. So that's the top end of the game. That doesn't look like it doesn't look like that for us, because our fullbacks are different. Some of them are younger, some of them are older. If we try and overlap, there's a chance the opposition might expose the space that we've left. So how do we appreciate when and where to overlap? So that's been an interesting one this season, over the last season or so. Centre halves not necessarily wanting to go across and cover that space. Midfield players not necessarily wanting to drop in. So we've had to build an understanding of, if we are going to have overlapping fullbacks, this is who it might be and this is when it might be. So that's been an interesting one. Playing out from the goalkeeper. Some great goalkeepers at the club, both of them with sort of pro club youth experience through to sort of 16 and 18. So really good goalkeepers. But it's trying to say to them, look, we'll believe in you to do this. Whereas it's not the norm for the audience. So the audience are screaming and shouting at the keeper to get rid of it, but we want to try and play out. But we don't play out all the time, because if the opposition recognise it, we also need to recognise when we play somewhere else. So it's not at the behest of just playing out all the time. It's trying to recognise when and where to play out from the goalkeeper. A high press. Everybody talks about it, but every now and again we'll get players that just fly off on their own and it becomes ineffective. So again, understanding when, where, who, how to do that type of stuff, but also understanding that the players might be fatigued after a possession element of the game, and then to go and try and press it and then turn the ball over might be the thing that gets us undone. So recognising when to press and when not. And then things like a low block. Again, it seems to be the talk on Twitter and the like, but why would we defend deep? What's the implications if we allow the opposition to come onto us and get close to our box? Why would we maybe not consider engaging earlier? So again, it's been great with the players that I'm working with at the minute, just to try and, if you want, investigate some of this stuff, because it is things that we will use, but it's in our world, and it's not the match of the day stuff and the World Cup stuff and the Champions League stuff that we see on the telly. It's our interpretation of this. And so therefore, it won't always look like it looks on the telly, but it'll look like it needs to look for us. So that's where we're going with some of this stuff at the minute. And for me, I've got to be comfortable as a coach and accept this stuff, because I think at the end of the day, it's about those players trying to perform to the best of their ability with all this, the sort of considerations that they've deal with in the game that we play. So that's where I got to.
Yes, Tony, as well. Sorry, before I pass over to Liv, I guess you look at those concepts there, and I mean, do you train once a week, twice a week?
Yeah, so I think sort of pre-season it was twice a week, and we were doing a little bit of physical, but then majority of work was two football sessions, if you want, tactical type stuff.
They're part-time, very part-time, aren't they? I mean, to level of detail in this would be very difficult, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and once the season was up and running, the season then rolled into sort of 2 games a week. So it was 2 games plus 1 training. So we would possibly train Monday, play Wednesday, play Saturday, or play Tuesday, train Thursday, play Saturday. So it became very much about trying to do more of this work than it was trying to do anything sort of physical, if you want, because they were getting enough physical work from the 2 games.
Yeah, I think I've played with somebody that's in the fire brigade, so even then they've got to do fitness tests as well, and so it's having to balance the physical side as well as all of that as well. So a lot to think about. There's a few questions if you're up for it, Tony.
Yes, please do.
There's one that says, going back to when you spoke about coach behaviours, my question is, oh, that's just moved. My question is, what would you consider to be the most effective coach behaviour that facilitates positive player actions? I can repeat that if you didn't get that.
Yeah. I suppose, as a not sitting on the fence answer, it goes back to this understanding each of the individuals. So for some, it may well be some one-to-one work with them, because that would really benefit them, and that might be driven by them. If you want to get better at something, you might seek somebody's advice to get better at doing that. So the player might be asking the coach, can you spend a bit of time with me and show me what you mean, or help me do that, more effectively. Depending on, again, the group, is it something that you might want to stop the whole group for and offer an alternative to what it is you're seeing, because you're seeing it from multiple players? That might be effective. Your group might be comfortable with the coach going, just hold it there and let me show you this. You might utilise one of the players who is performing the piece of work effectively. So you do want to use that. Does that have an impact on players? Potentially. Some younger players might be, I don't want to be doing this in front of my peers. So that's not necessarily going to work for some, but it might work for others. And I know, I've had experiences of players who think if they're being stopped, they're being corrected, therefore they're wrong. And it's not necessarily the wrong we're after. It's trying to help them improve the performance. And you look into other sports and you talk to, or you find out about coaches in other sports. Minicello, who was Jess Innes's coach, he said her attention to detail, and she was an elite performer. I'm not trying to compare, but she would ask really posing questions of him as to what she had to do better, and he would have to have the answers. Similarly, sort of, golf coaches and caddies who work with top golfers will have answers to support their performer. So I think as a coach, I'm not trying to sit on the fence. I'm trying to offer a series of alternatives, because there are so many out there that, will work for your player or players and won't work. And it's about understanding, I suppose, them and recognising which one will be the most effective for the situation you face.
Good.
Does that answer that?
There's some really good questions coming in here. How do you reflect after training and games, and how has that evolved or changed over the years?
Yeah, hugely changed. I probably didn't write anything down historically. When I was first working as a coach, I probably never sat down and really reflected. I didn't really understand reflection. I think as I was part of sort of the construction of courses and we looked into the realms of reflection, it became more apparent that this was an area, and it still is, I think, for every coach. We need to be better reflectors. The models that the FA used to have in terms of plan, do, review, and the suggestion was that you should, devote equal times to all three, was always going to be a challenge in the sort of volunteer non-league game that we're generally involved in. I think, it's very emotive as well when you reflect. So I think sometimes you can come out of a training session, or you can come off after a game, and because of whatever's gone on, your emotions are running a little bit high, and you might not necessarily reflect as clearly. So I think something that I've sort of adopted is, something immediate with maybe people that I've worked alongside, and we've discussed what it is that's gone on. Maybe it's a chance, a couple of maybe it's a day or so later, and again, picking up the phone to one of my colleagues at the club and just having a chat about things that we, recognised on the night or after the game, or things that we need to maybe build into the next session. And I do a lot of audio stuff now, so I use my phone and stuff that we used to say to coaches on courses, do this stuff. I find myself doing it more. There's a great piece of research being done and a great piece of work being done by a woman called Amy Whitehead, who is Professor Dr. Amy Whitehead. She's done something called Think Aloud protocols. It was investigated a good few years ago, but she's done some stuff in sport over the last few years. And if anybody wants to have a look at that, just go online and have a look for Dr. Amy Whitehead. You'll find some great stuff that's being done around reflection and sort of inaction reflection, which is another concept you can try and consider. But yeah, my reflection piece has definitely changed.
Good start.
I
think
sorry, Libby, I know where we got questions in both chat box and Q&A. There's a couple of former colleagues. I wonder if Julie Chase was asked a question in the chat, and Jamie Godbold. Are we all right to address those?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Libby, do you want me to read them, or are you all right? Have you found them?
Go for it, Steve.
Julie's asked, do we focus enough time and effort as coaches on fully understanding the basic techniques and skills of the game, which in turn enables us to support and develop players? I guess that's going back to that detail bit, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, historically, and Julie will be one, and there'll be others on this call, that, the technical elements of the game were really well taught and really well thought of in the past. And I'm going back, sort of 30, 40 years with some of this stuff. The guy who was sort of director of coaching at the FA, a guy called Walter Winterbottom, was the first one. If you want to have a look for some of his work, have a look at that. The real technicalities of the game were something that coaching, and this wasn't just in this country, this was everywhere, and across sport, people went after real technical understanding, because if you could get the technical pieces correct, then there was a chance you would be able to evolve them into the tactical sides of the game. So I can pass the ball, but have I got a selection of passes that I might choose from, because my technical understanding is such, and therefore I figure out which one to use in that situation. So I think that there has been definitely a move away from that technical piece, and I think there is something that should be, considered by coaches. Dick Bates, who was a colleague, but also he was a person that I sort of aspired to be like, was a real advocate for the technical side of the game. Unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago now, and he has left an anthology of 3,500 pages of content based around the technical tactical elements of the game that he was a real advocate for. So I think, as coaches, depending on where you work and what it is you want the players to be better at, I think, yeah, there is definitely a need for me to go after it. And maybe it's me as a coach, I'm in that sort of, I'm in that cohort of people who wants the players to be better technically, to be able to perform tactically when it comes to it. So that's probably me as a person.
I think also, Tony, if I can just add on the end of that, I think something I've noticed in the last few years is that coaches are including myself, very, very keen to develop a tactical understanding, and they're really intrigued by the tactical side of the game. But maybe we just hope the technical stuff comes. We just sort of, cross our fingers and hope for the best, whereas the tactics really intrigues us.
To practice, practices that I've done and just recently with the players and seeing other coaches do similar, where the players will take part in stuff, but they won't necessarily perform anything better. And it's for me as a coach to try and help them recognize that difference of pass, that difference of movement, that difference of, receiving touch, that, turn away from pressure or turn into pressure, whatever it might be. It's for me to try and help them understand that better, I think. Yeah. that's something I think we certainly need.
I'll ask Jamie's question then. He said great points on non-league stuff. Can the game at non-league ever look like the game at Premier League, e.g., possession-based philosophy on the state of the majority of these pitches, or high press with a group that have been working all day long?
Yeah, no, great points, and I think it's like I've said on their slides here, the reality of these concepts. So the team that I'm looking after, we want to be a possession-based team, and at times we have a really good go, but the pitches do dictate sometimes whether we can or can't. Sometimes the opposition work us out and come after us, and therefore we've got to be better at recognising maybe when to play into other areas and not necessarily keep trying to build out. So that's something that I suppose is different. I think where we are as a non-league now, I think because of the players who are in it, because of their experiences as younger players, whether that's from sort of an academy opportunity or the grassroots game, we play the game differently in this country now. You know, across the spectrum, we play this game differently because I think not everybody wants to just kick it and chase it. Not everybody wants to just hit it and kick it. You know, we're actually, as you know, coaches in this country and probably across the UK, we appreciate the game and we want to see the game, if we're involved in it, played better. So therefore our players' experiences as younger players is different, and therefore what they come through to is playing in an adult game, where I think a number of coaches in the adult game now actually want their players to do this and not turn possession over, not give it back to the opponent, you know, as quickly as you've received it. That's the coaches, and the players don't want to play like that. So I think our game looks different at the moment. And I think, you know, realistically, if that's what you want to go after, then, you know, don't if you want, become a victim of other people's desires. If you think your team and the game that you're involved in can be played in a better way, then that's the sort of stuff I think you should go after. Yes, the facilities will dictate sometimes, but I think there isn't anything wrong with trying to be better at doing the possession stuff. And similarly, when it comes to that high press type idea, yeah, when people have put an 8-hour, 10-hour day in and travelled, and then we're asking them to do a load of physical stuff, we do need to consider that just because it happens in the Premier League doesn't mean it has to happen with us. It might well be that setting up little triggers and traps to lull the opposition into when we go after it, instead of maybe as a high press to try and turn it over as soon as the opposition have won the ball off us.
Right. I think we might have, it leads really nicely into this one. Sorry if we've not answered your question. So this is probably going to be the last one. Are we better to develop players for the game they are playing now or the game they may play later? Thinking of under 18s playing for the particular philosophy of play, though they might move club. So a master of one or a jack of all? Big question.
Yeah, it is good. Very good question. I think obviously if you've got an under 18s, under 16s, under 18s team type thing, and there is a potential for them moving on to play for the first team of that club, you've probably got some understanding of how the first team plays. So therefore introducing some of that stuff to them, or introducing them to the first team type opportunity might be something that you do. I think you've got to help them play the game they're involved in, but with an eye on where they'll go next. Now, they may head off to university at 18 and not play for your club and end up playing at university. They may progress and go and play in the adult game, but not for your club because the level it's too far a step, if you want, but they need adult football. So I think, yeah, there is, as challenging as it is, I think we have to deal with the situation that we're in. but at the same time having an appreciation of where they will go. So I think possibly allowing the players to maybe get access to what that next opportunity looks like, and that doesn't necessarily mean playing in it. It might be just going along and having a look. You know, go and watch what the non-league game looks like that you're going to play in next. Go and see university football if that's where you're headed to, because you might go, actually, yeah, I'll be okay in there. You know, I'll be able to deal with that. Or I need to understand this thing differently. So what sort of things maybe do I need to have in place if you want to help me on that journey to the next opportunity wherever I play? And I think that's the same as well for players who come down out of other levels. You know, one of the challenges for younger players who are released by clubs, certainly at 16, if they come in to play at your 18s opportunity, but they've been in a club situation for a number of years, that'll take some adapting to, whereas the game they would have played in maybe an academy setting won't be the same as the grassroots setting that they're going to be involved in. So helping them in that is certainly something we need. And similarly, you know, academy players released at 18 going into the non-league game, it sometimes is a big step. And how do we as coaches try and manage them, if that's the level that you're working at, how do you manage them into that next opportunity? And that's something that I'm dealing with firsthand at the moment. I've got a couple of lads who've been released by pro clubs at 18, and you know, the world fell apart because they didn't get what they thought they were going to get, which was a professional contract. And now they're playing in non-league football and a good way down the pyramid system. But it doesn't make them bad players, and it doesn't make them bad people, because they are very talented. It just means they didn't fit at this moment in time. But they hopefully, knowing the players that they are, they aspire to play higher. They understand the system that they're in, and they're willing to work at the moment to be better playing in this level, because it'll hopefully allow them to go to the next level in the future.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks, Tony. That's been incredible to hear. And, you know, guys, if you are here on Monday as well, you can just see even in 2 nights that we're covering some big stuff. And we've still got 20 odd webinars to go. So it's exciting to see what's next. We've got Paul on Saturday. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. But we're going to call it a night. Tony, thank you so much. Steve, any last words for these wonderful people?
Just to thank you for Tony for joining us. It's been brilliant, and to all the familiar names on the side of the screen I'm looking at now. And you're not seeing the hat. So there. Thanks, Tony. Really appreciate that.
No problem.
Thanks, Libby.
It was great to see everybody. And I'll leave you this slide. I'll send it on to you, Steve, so you've got it.
Okay, mate.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll send the slides out. We'll send the recording of this to you all. So looking forward to it.
You see some familiar names, Tony?
I didn't have a look on the list.
All right, there's all. Look on the chat. Just if you're on the chat.
I've seen Derek's names on there. George Hamill, yeah. Mel Jeffries was on it. Nice.
Mel, you know Mel, yeah.
Yeah. Sally Needham, is she stalking us at the moment?
You can do the same Monday. She's on Monday, so you can do the same.
Good.
I'll stop recording.
It's lovely to see some